The room went dead quiet when my lawyer said, "Your Honor, one more witness." I felt it before I understood it, my chest locking up, my breath caught halfway in. I stared at the courtroom doors as if my eyes alone could stop them from opening. "No, it can't be," I whispered inside my head. Across the aisle, my father still wore that smug little smile he'd carried all morning. My brother leaned back in his chair, arms crossed like this was already over. They thought they had me cornered. They had no idea what was about to walk through that door. And neither, if I'm honest, did I. That moment, frozen in time, the judge waiting, the air thick as syrup, was the moment everything in my life seemed to come rushing back at once. But to understand how I ended up there, standing in a small-town courthouse in western Pennsylvania, facing my own father and brother like enemies, you have to know what came before. I walked into the county courthouse that morning just after 8, the November air biting at my cheeks. The building was old red brick built sometime before the war, with tall steps worn smooth by generations of boots and shoes. Inside it smelled faintly of polish and paper, the same smell I remembered from jury duty years ago before I'd shipped out again. I wasn't in uniform. I'd thought about it. But my lawyer Mark suggested I dress like myself, plain slacks, a dark sweater, low heels. Let them see the woman, not just the rank, he said. So that's what I did. Still, I carried myself the only way I knew how, back straight, shoulders, square eyes forward. 20 years in the Marine Corps will do that to you. I saw them before they saw me. My father sat on the left side of the courtroom. Thick gray hair combed back his best brown suit, stretched tight across his chest. He looked just like he always had, solid, unbending, certain the world would move the way he wanted if he pushed hard enough. Beside him was my brother Eric, a few years older than me, wearing a confident smirk like armor. They didn't stand when I came in. They didn't nod. They didn't even look surprised. To them, I was still the daughter who'd left, the one who ran off to play soldier, as Dad liked to tell folks at the diner. I slid into the seat beside Mark and folded my hands in my lap. My palms were damp. I wiped them on my sweater and took a slow breath, just like I'd been taught before stepping into any high-pressure situation. In through the nose, out through the mouth, stay calm. But this wasn't a battlefield I'd trained for. This was blood. The case was simple on paper. After my mother died last year, Dad and Eric filed to claim full ownership of our family home and the surrounding acreage, 40 acres of rolling fields and woods my grandparents had bought after World War II. They argued that since I'd been gone most of my adult life, deployed here and there, I had abandoned any claim to it. They said I didn't need it, that I had the government paycheck and no roots left in town. What they didn't mention was that I'd helped pay the taxes for years, that I'd sent money home when Mom got sick, that she and I had talked quietly about what she wanted long before she passed. But Dad had always had his own version of things. And in this town, people listened to him. He'd run the hardware store for 3 decades, sponsored Little League teams, sat on the church board. Folks called him Mr. Harris with respect in their voices. I was just the daughter who disappeared. When the judge entered, everyone rose. He was an older man with silver hair and kind eyes, the sort who reminded me of a high school principal, firm but fair. We sat, and the hearing began. Dad's lawyer went first. He painted a picture of loyalty and tradition, of a son who stayed to help his aging father, of a daughter who chose a distant life and left the family behind. He talked about continuity, about keeping the land where it belonged. Then Eric took the stand. He talked about mowing fields, fixing fences, driving Mom to appointments. Some of it was true, some of it wasn't. He didn't mention the times I'd called from overseas begging for updates, or the nights I'd sat in a bunk half a world away staring at my phone waiting for news. When Dad testified, he didn't even look at me. "She made her choice," he said flatly. "We respected it, but choices have consequences." Those words hit harder than anything else that morning. I kept my face still. Inside, something cracked. When it was our turn, Mark stood and spoke calmly, laying out facts, documents, timelines. He questioned Dad gently but firmly, pointing out inconsistencies. He introduced financial records showing my contributions. Still, I could feel the room leaning away from me. I was the outsider here. Then the judge looked at Mark and said, "Counsel, unless you have something more substantial, I think I've heard enough." Mark didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "We have one more witness." That was when the room went quiet. That was when my chest locked. Because in that instant I realized who he meant. And all I could think was, no, it can't be. I stared at the closed wooden doors at the side of the courtroom. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, loud as boots on a steel deck. I could barely hear the shuffle of papers, the murmur of curiosity rippling through the benches behind us. Across from me, Dad's smile tightened. Then just for a second it faltered. He didn't know yet. But he was about to. And when he saw who would walk in, nothing in our lives would ever be the same. The judge hadn't yet called for the witness. He was still adjusting his glasses, shuffling papers, letting the silence stretch. That pause felt endless, like the seconds before a storm breaks. As I sat there, my mind drifted not away from the moment, but straight back through a lifetime of being written off. Because this wasn't just about land. It never had been. I grew up in that old farmhouse at the edge of town, white clapboard, green shutters, porch boards that creaked, no matter how many times Dad nailed them down. From the outside, we looked like every other hard-working American family, Dad running the hardware store, Mom keeping the house, Eric and I riding bikes up and down the gravel drive. But inside there was always a quiet line drawn. Eric on one side, me on the other. Dad never said it outright, but everyone knew Eric was the one. The son who would carry on the name, take over the store, keep the land. I was supposed to marry someone local, settle down nearby, and not rock the boat. When I told them at 18 that I'd enlisted in the Marine Corps, the room went silent in a way that still feels familiar now. Mom cried. Eric laughed, thinking I was joking. Dad just stared at me like I'd spoken another language. Girls don't do that, he finally said. And not from this family. But I'd already made up my mind. I wanted out of the narrow future he'd planned for me. I wanted to serve. I wanted to prove, maybe to him, maybe to myself, that I was more than the shadow beside my brother. So I left. Boot camp was harder than anything I'd known. My body ached, my hands blistered. I learned quickly that no one cared where I came from, only whether I could keep up. And I did. Not perfectly, but enough. I wrote letters home every week at first. I didn't always get letters back. Dad's replies were short, stiff if they came at all. Eric's were rare. Mom tried her best, but even her words felt careful, like she didn't want to upset the balance back home. Over the years, I deployed more times than I can count. Desert heat, foreign streets, long nights listening for sounds that meant danger. I lost friends. I learned how fragile life really is. And through it all, I kept calling home. Hoping. When Mom got sick, things changed, at least between her and me. She didn't want to worry Dad, she said, so she told me instead. Late-night phone calls, her voice tired but steady, telling me about doctor visits, about the treatments, about how Dad refused to accept how serious it was. I'm proud of you, she told me once when she thought I was asleep on the other end, even if he doesn't know how to say it. I sent money when I could, more than I could afford sometimes, for medicine, for repairs, for anything she needed. Dad never thanked me. When she passed, I was overseas. I couldn't make it back in time for the funeral. That's something I'll carry with me forever. I stood in a dusty corner of the world in my dress uniform, listening to the chaplain's words through a shaky connection, while they buried my mother without me. And Dad never called. Not that day. Not the next. Not at all. I only found out about the lawsuit months later when a certified letter reached me at base. By then, Dad and Eric had already started telling people I didn't care, that I hadn't even come home when Mom died. They never mentioned I wasn't allowed to leave. That letter hit harder than any firefight. But I didn't fire back. I didn't rage. I contacted a lawyer and started gathering what I had: bank statements, messages, Mom's last letters to me. I prepared quietly, like I always had. Now, sitting in that courtroom, all of it rushed through me as I waited for the judge to speak again. I could feel Dad's eyes on me at last. There was something different in them now, not confidence but unease. The judge cleared his throat. Very well, he said. Call your witness. Mark stood. The doors behind us creaked as the bailiff moved toward them. My heart hammered. And still a part of me prayed I was wrong. That it wouldn't be who I thought. Because if it was, everything Dad believed about me was about to fall apart. I barely heard the judge's words when he said, "Call your witness." The sound that swallowed everything else was my own heartbeat, loud and uneven like boots on a hollow floor. Mark gave me a brief look, steady, reassuring, then turned toward the doors. The bailiff moved first. Every head in the courtroom followed him. I sat frozen, hands clenched in my lap, my mind screaming the same words over and over. No, it can't be. Because if the person I thought was about to walk in really was outside that door, then this wasn't just about land anymore. This was about everything my father had ever believed about me. And everything he was about to learn. But before those doors opened, my mind betrayed me again, pulling me back to the moment when I first realized how far this had gone. It was the phone call. I'd just come off a 12-hour shift on base, bone-tired, when I saw Mark's number. We'd spoken earlier that week about documents I'd sent, and I assumed it was more routine. Instead, his voice was tight. "They're saying you abandoned the property," he told me, "that you forfeited any claim by leaving for the military." I laughed at first. I actually laughed. It sounded ridiculous. "I was serving my country," I said. "They know that." Mark paused. "They're saying you chose not to come back, that you could have if you really wanted." That was when it hit me. Not just that they were trying to take the land, but that they were rewriting my life, painting my service as selfishness, turning my absence into a crime. That night, I sat alone in my quarters, staring at the wall, thinking about every holiday I'd missed, every birthday call I'd made from a different time zone, every sacrifice that had felt worth it, because I believed deep down that my family understood. I realized then that my father never had. Back in the courtroom, the judge leaned forward slightly, hands folded. "Mr. Reynolds," he said to Mark, "this witness had better be relevant." "Yes, Your Honor," Mark replied, "very much so." Dad shifted in his seat. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. He didn't look at me, he looked at Mark, irritation flashing across his face. "This is a waste of time," he muttered loud enough for a few people nearby to hear. Eric smirked again, though it didn't reach his eyes. They still thought this was a bluff. I swallowed hard. They were wrong. I thought about the last time I'd seen the man I hoped was outside that door. It had been 5 years earlier after a long deployment. I'd been exhausted, dusty, emotionally wrung out, standing on the tarmac while families reunited around me. I didn't have anyone waiting, I never did. But he had been there not as family but as something else, as proof that someone saw me. He'd shaken my hand, looked me in the eye and said, "You did good work out there, Captain. You should be proud." I'd almost cried. Not because of praise, but because it had been so long since I'd heard anything like it. Before he left, he'd said, "If you ever need me, you know how to reach me." At the time, I'd smiled politely, never imagining I would. Now, sitting in that courtroom, I realized how close I'd come to never making that call. The bailiff reached the door. My breath caught. I stared so hard my eyes burned. Dad leaned forward slightly, trying to see past him, curiosity finally creeping into his expression. The judge nodded. "Bring in the witness." The bailiff pulled the door open. But before anyone stepped through, Mark cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said before the witness enters, "may I briefly explain the nature of their testimony?" The judge hesitated, then nodded, briefly. Mark turned to face the courtroom. "This witness will speak to Ms. Harris's character, her service, and her legal arrangements regarding her estate and assets during deployment," he said. "Arrangements that directly contradict the claim that she abandoned her responsibilities or her property." A murmur rippled through the room. Dad's face tightened. "What arrangements?" he snapped. The judge shot him a look. "You'll have a chance to respond after the testimony, Mr. Harris." Mark finished. "They will also clarify Ms. Harris's relationship with her late mother during that period." That last line felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I dropped my eyes, fighting the sudden sting behind them. Mom. Dad had always claimed he'd handled everything, that she'd trusted him. I knew better. The judge nodded again. "Very well, proceed." The bailiff stepped aside. And then finally the witness walked in. At first all I saw was a tall silhouette against the light from the hallway. Broad shoulders, measured steps, the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Then the door closed behind him. And the room seemed to shrink. He wore a dark suit, but there was no mistaking the posture, the bearing, the presence. Even out of uniform, he carried it with him, the weight of command, of responsibility, of years spent leading others into impossible situations. He removed his hat, held it respectfully at his side, and met my eyes for just a moment. There was no surprise in his face. Only calm. Only recognition. Only support. I felt my throat close. It is him, I thought. It really is. Gasps fluttered through the benches. Someone whispered, "Is that who I think it is?" Dad's smile vanished. Not slowly. It collapsed. Like something hollow that finally gave way. He stared at the man walking toward the stand, his mouth opening slightly, then closing again as if words refused to form. Eric leaned forward, squinting, confusion giving way to something like fear. I saw Dad shake his head once. "No," he murmured. "No, that's not." But it was. The witness took his place, raised his hand, and swore to tell the truth. When he sat, he looked straight ahead, then turned his gaze calmly toward the judge. "My name is James Caldwell," he said. "I am a retired United States Marine Corps general, and I served as Ms. Harris's commanding officer." The words echoed through the courtroom. And in that moment I knew my father finally understood. Not just who had walked in, but who I really was. When General Caldwell spoke my name, it felt like the walls themselves leaned in to listen. "Ms. Harris," he repeated, his voice steady, clear, carrying easily across the room. "I've known her for over 15 years. I sat there barely breathing, my eyes locked on him. I hadn't seen him since that day on the tarmac, but he hadn't changed. The same calm authority. The same quiet gravity that made people straighten without being told. Across the aisle, my father looked like he'd been struck. His face had gone pale, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between me and the man at the witness stand. Eric whispered something to him, but Dad didn't answer. For the first time that day, he looked unsure. Mark stepped forward. "General Caldwell, can you tell the court how you know Ms. Harris?" "Yes," the general said. "I was her commanding officer during 2 deployments and later oversaw her promotion. I've reviewed her service record in detail over the years." He paused, then added, "She is one of the finest officers I've had the privilege to lead." A murmur moved through the courtroom. I kept my face still, but inside something swelled, not pride exactly, but relief, to finally hear someone say it out loud. Mark nodded. "General, are you familiar with the sacrifices Ms. Harris made during her service?" "I am," Caldwell replied. "Extended deployments, missed holidays, time away from family. That is the nature of service. She never once complained. She focused on her duty." He turned slightly, his eyes briefly finding mine again. "She earned every commendation she received." Dad shifted in his seat, uncomfortable now, as if the air around him had changed. Mark continued, "General, are you aware of the legal arrangements Ms. Harris made regarding her assets and property while she was deployed?" "Yes," Caldwell said. "Ms. Harris approached me before her last deployment. She was concerned about ensuring her affairs were handled properly while she was overseas. At my recommendation, she worked with military legal counsel to establish an escrow and power of attorney arrangement protecting her interests." He reached into his folder and held up a document. I was listed as an emergency military contact and witness to those arrangements. Mark accepted the document and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "This escrow included her share of family assets?" Mark asked. "Yes," Caldwell said. "Funds she contributed toward the family property were documented and protected. These arrangements explicitly state that no transfer or claim could be made without her direct authorization." My father's head snapped up. What he blurted. The judge raised a hand sharply. "Mr. Harris, you will not interrupt." Dad sank back, his face flushed, now eyes wide. Mark turned slightly. "General, did Ms. Harris express concern about her family when she made these arrangements?" "Yes," Caldwell said. "She was worried about her mother's health. She wanted to make sure any support she provided was secure and used for its intended purpose." I felt my throat tighten. He remembered that. Then came the question I knew was coming. General Mark said gently, "Did you have any interaction with Ms. Harris's mother during this time?" Caldwell's expression softened. "I did. Mrs. Harris contacted me once with her daughter's knowledge. She wanted to confirm the arrangements and to thank me for looking out for her child." A hush fell over the room. He went on. "She spoke very highly of her daughter. Said she was proud of her service, said she worried that her husband didn't fully understand what that meant. My eyes burned. I blinked hard, but a tear slipped free anyway, tracing down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. Dad stared at the table in front of him, his face rigid. Mark let that settle before continuing. General, based on your knowledge, would you say Ms. Harris abandoned her responsibilities to her family or her property? Caldwell didn't hesitate. Absolutely not. She took every reasonable step to protect both, despite being in active service to this country. He looked straight toward my father now, though he didn't address him directly. She did what honorable people do. The words landed heavy. Eric swallowed hard. His earlier confidence had drained away, leaving him stiff and quiet. Dad's lawyer rose, trying to regain control. General Caldwell, with all due respect, you can't possibly know what went on in this family. You weren't there. You don't live in this community. Caldwell turned calmly toward him. You're correct. I wasn't there. But I know Ms. Harris, and I know the character required to serve as she has. That is not speculation. That is experience. He paused, then added, and I also know that documents don't lie. The judge nodded slowly, studying the papers in front of him. As Caldwell finished, I realized something. For the first time in my life, someone was standing between me and my father, not physically, but in truth, speaking for me in a way I never could as a child. When Mark said no further questions, Your Honor, I felt a strange mix of strength and sorrow wash over me. The judge turned to Dad's lawyer. Any further questions? The lawyer hesitated, glanced at Dad, then shook his head. No, Your Honor. General Caldwell stood, nodded once in my direction, and stepped down. As he passed by, he paused just long enough to whisper, You did good. Whatever happens now. I closed my eyes for a moment. Across the aisle, my father no longer looked smug. He looked small. And for the first time, I saw fear there. The courtroom felt different after General Caldwell stepped down. Like the air itself had shifted. People who'd been whispering earlier now sat in uneasy silence. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, eyes moving slowly from the papers in front of him to my father, then to me. My dad wouldn't look at me anymore. He kept his gaze fixed on the table, jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Eric, on the other hand, was staring at me now, really looking for the first time, like he was trying to figure out who I was all over again. I sat still, hands folded, heart pounding, but outwardly calm. Years in uniform had taught me how to hold a steady face when everything inside was shaking. Mark rose again. Your Honor, he said, we'd like to submit additional evidence related to Mrs. Harris's will and the circumstances surrounding its preparation. Dad's head snapped up. What will he demanded before he could stop himself? The judge fixed him with a firm look. Mr. Harris, I've already warned you. Dad sank back, but his face had gone red now. Anger fighting with something else. Fear, maybe. Mark continued. We have reason to believe that the original will drafted before Mrs. Harris's illness worsened reflected intentions very different from what was later presented. A murmur rippled through the room. My stomach tightened. This was the part I'd been dreading. Because no matter how justified dragging my mother's final days into public view felt like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. But it had to be done. Mark called the next witness, a quiet, middle-aged woman with silver hair pulled into a bun, Mom's longtime friend and neighbor, Mrs. Collins. She walked slowly to the stand, hands folded around her purse, eyes soft but determined. I've known Linda Harris for over 30 years, she said after being sworn in. We raised our kids together, had coffee every Tuesday. She glanced at me, offering a small, sad smile. Your mother talked about you often, she said. She was so proud. My throat tightened again. Mrs. Collins went on to explain how, in the months before Mom died, she'd helped drive her to appointments when Dad was busy at the store. How Mom had confided in her worries not just about her health, but about making sure things were fair between her children. She told me she wanted both her kids taken care of, Mrs. Collins said, but she was especially worried about her daughter being so far away serving. She said, I don't want her forgotten just because she isn't here. Dad stared straight ahead, his face like stone. Then Mark presented the documents. Copies of Mom's earlier will. Letters she'd written to me that I'd kept even when it hurt too much to read them. Bank statements showing my contributions. And finally a record of the later will, the one Dad and Eric were relying on, signed when Mom was heavily medicated just weeks before she passed. Mark spoke carefully, respectfully, but firmly. This later will drastically reduces Ms. Harris's share and transfers full control to Mr. Harris and his son, he said. We believe undue influence played a role. Dad shot to his feet. That's a lie, he shouted. She knew what she was doing. The judge banged his gavel. Mr. Harris, sit down or I will have you removed. Dad sank back again, breathing hard, eyes blazing. Eric finally spoke, his voice strained. Dad, maybe we should... Be quiet, Dad snapped. They're trying to twist everything. But I could hear the crack in his certainty now. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. Mark turned to Eric. Mr. Harris, he said, did you accompany your mother to the lawyer's office when this later will was signed? Eric hesitated. Yes, he said slowly. And was your father present? Eric swallowed. Yes. Did your mother ask for her daughter to be included in that meeting? Eric's eyes flicked toward Dad, then back to Mark. She mentioned it, he admitted. But Dad said there wasn't time, that it would just upset her. A collective gasp went through the room. Dad's head whipped toward Eric. What are you doing? He hissed. Eric's face was pale now, his earlier bravado gone. I'm telling the truth, he said quietly. Mark pressed on. Did your mother seem fully aware of the changes being made? Eric hesitated again, longer this time. She was tired, he said. Confused sometimes. She kept asking where my sister was. Dad told her she didn't need to worry about that. My chest felt like it was caving in. I stared at Eric, hardly recognizing him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Mark turned back to the judge. Your Honor, this testimony combined with the medical records and prior documents suggests that Mrs. Harris's final will does not reflect her true intent. The judge nodded slowly, flipping through the papers again. Dad looked like he was about to explode. You don't know what you're doing, he barked. You weren't there when she was dying, I was. I finally stood. My legs shook, but I stood anyway. I know you were there, I said, my voice quiet but clear. And I thank you for that. But you don't get to erase me because I wasn't. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward me. I called, I went on, I wrote, I sent money, I loved her, and she loved me. Just because I wasn't in this town doesn't mean I wasn't her daughter. For a moment no one spoke. Even Dad seemed stunned into silence. The judge cleared his throat. Ms. Harris, thank you. Please have a seat. I sat, my heart racing, hands trembling now that I'd let the words out. The judge leaned forward. I will take this evidence under advisement, he said. But I will say this, the court takes allegations of undue influence very seriously. Dad slumped back in his chair. For the first time that day he looked old. Not powerful. Not commanding. Just tired and scared. I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow. Because no matter how this ended, nothing could give me back my mother. Nothing could undo the fact that our family had been torn open in front of strangers. But as I sat there listening to the judge prepare to rule, I knew one thing for certain. The truth was finally on the table, and it was heavier than any lie my father had ever told. The judge called a short recess before delivering his ruling. We filed out into the narrow hallway outside the courtroom, the kind with faded linoleum floors and wooden benches bolted to the wall. Sunlight filtered in through tall windows, casting long, pale stripes across the floor. I sat alone on one of those benches, hands clasped so tightly my knuckles ached. Across the hall my father stood with his lawyer, speaking in low, urgent tones. Eric hovered nearby, looking like he didn't know where he belonged anymore. No one came toward me. And for once I didn't chase after them. Mark sat beside me. You did well in there, he said quietly. I nodded, though my stomach was still in knots. I didn't plan to speak. Sometimes the truth needs a voice, he said. After a few minutes the bailiff opened the doors again. All rise. We filed back in. This time when I took my seat I felt different. Still afraid, yes, but steadier. Whatever happened next, I had said my piece. The judge looked at us for a long moment before speaking, his expression thoughtful. I have reviewed the testimony and the evidence presented today, he said. This is not just a dispute over property, it is a matter of intent, trust, and fairness. He paused, then continued. Based on the documentation, the testimony of witnesses, and the circumstances surrounding the execution of the later, will this court find significant reason to question its validity? Dad's breath caught audibly. Eric closed his eyes. The judge went on. Therefore, the court recognizes the earlier will and accompanying financial arrangements as the true reflection of Mrs. Harris's wishes. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Accordingly, the judge said ownership of the family property shall be awarded primarily to Ms. Harris, with provisions for fair accommodation to Mr. Harris, as outlined in the earlier documents. For a moment I couldn't move. The words echoed in my ears. Awarded to Ms. Harris. Me. A wave of whispers swept through the room. I heard someone behind me mutter, "Well, I'll be—" Mark placed a hand lightly on my arm. Dad slumped back in his chair as if someone had cut his strings. Eric stared at the floor. The judge raised his gavel. This court is adjourned. And just like that it was over. Outside, the November air felt colder, sharper, but cleaner too. A few local reporters lingered near the steps, scribbling notes, murmuring among themselves. I avoided their eyes and focused instead on the old oak tree across the street, its leaves nearly gone, branches bare against the gray sky. Mark shook my hand. "Congratulations," he said, if that's the right word. "I'm not sure it is," I replied honestly. He nodded understanding. "Call me if you need anything." Then he left, blending into the small crowd. I stood there alone for a moment. Then I heard my name. I turned to see my father a few steps away. Up close, he looked smaller than I remembered. The lines on his face were deeper. His eyes, once so sharp now, seemed tired, almost lost. Eric stood a little behind him, hands in his pockets, not meeting my gaze. Dad cleared his throat. "I didn't expect that," he said. "I know," I replied. There was an awkward silence. I didn't know he went on quieter now about all that. The general, the money, your mother talking to people. I held his gaze. "You never asked." That landed harder than I meant it to. He winced slightly. After a moment he said, "Why didn't you tell me who you'd become?" I almost laughed at that. "Why didn't you ever want to know?" I asked back. His shoulders sagged. Eric shifted, finally looking at me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, "for what I said in there, for letting it go this far." I studied him for a long second. "I appreciate you telling the truth," I said. "That mattered." He nodded, swallowing hard. Dad looked between us, then back at me. "What happens now?" he asked. I took a slow breath. "I don't want to take your home away," I said. "That place means something to me too, to Mom, to all of us." His eyes flickered with hope. "But it has to be different," I continued. "Clear, honest, no more pretending I don't exist. I'll keep ownership, but you can live there. We'll work out the details. Fair for everyone." He stared at me, stunned. "You'd do that?" he asked. "Yes," I said simply, "not because you tried to take it, but because I don't want this to be how we end." His eyes filled just a little. He turned away, rubbing his face with one hand. "I was wrong," he murmured, "about a lot of things. It wasn't a full apology, but it was something." That evening I drove out to the old property alone. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the fields gold and amber. The farmhouse stood quiet, smoke rising from the chimney. Dad had already gone back. I parked by the fence and got out, walking slowly along the edge of the field. I thought about the little girl who used to run barefoot through this grass, about the young woman who'd left in anger and hope, about the Marine officer who'd come back carrying both pride and scars. I hadn't won anything today. Not really. What I'd gained was something harder and maybe more valuable. My name. My truth. My place in the story of this family. And as the cold air filled my lungs, I whispered to myself, "Mom, I hope I did right by you." The weeks after the court ruling passed more quietly than I expected. No more phone calls from lawyers, no letters stamped with official seals. Just the slow return of ordinary days, early mornings, cold air, the sound of boots on gravel, as I walked across base before sunrise. But inside me nothing felt ordinary. Every night I lay awake thinking about that moment outside the courthouse. My father's tired eyes. Eric's shaky apology. The way the words "I was wrong" had hung in the air between us, fragile as glass. I'd gone back to the farmhouse once since then just to check on things. Dad was on the porch bundled in his old flannel jacket, sipping coffee like he had every morning for as long as I could remember. When he saw me pull up, he stood slowly, unsure. We didn't hug. We didn't argue either. We just stood there for a second, looking at each other like strangers who shared the same face. I fixed the fence along the south field, he said finally. One post was leaning. Thank you, I replied. That was it. But it was a start. I thought a lot about what winning really meant. On paper, I now owned most of the land. The deed was being updated. The bank account settled. Legally, everything was clear. Emotionally, nothing was. I'd spent so many years telling myself I didn't care what my father thought, that his approval didn't matter, that I was strong enough without it. But sitting alone in my quarters at night, I had to admit the truth. It still hurt. It hurt that he'd never asked about my promotions. That he'd told people I'd dropped out instead of saying I was a Marine officer. That it had taken a courtroom and a general to make him see me. Some victories come with a bruise. A few days before I was scheduled to head back out of state for training, I got a call from Eric. I almost didn't answer. But I did. Hey, he said, his voice awkward. Dad and we were wondering if you might come by before you leave. Just talk. I closed my eyes, took a breath. All right, I said, I can stop by tomorrow. The farmhouse looked the same as always, white paint chipped in places, porch steps worn, smooth wind chimes tapping softly in the breeze. Inside it smelled like coffee and old wood. Dad sat at the kitchen table. Eric leaned against the counter. The chair Mom used to sit in was empty. That hit me harder than I expected. We stood there for a moment, none of us sure how to begin. Finally, I pulled out a chair and sat. I don't have much time, I said gently, but I'm here. Dad nodded, folding his hands on the table. I've been thinking, he said, about a lot of things, about you, about your mother. He cleared his throat. I didn't understand what you did, where you went, what it took. And instead of trying, I told myself it didn't matter. He looked up at me, then really looked. That was wrong. The words hung in the air. I waited, heart pounding. I was proud of Eric because he stayed, Dad went on. Because he was here doing what I knew. But that doesn't mean what you did was less. I see that now. Eric shifted uncomfortably. I should have said something, he added. When you weren't around, he'd say you didn't care. And I just let it go. I liked being the good son. He winced. That's on me. I studied them both. For years I'd imagined this moment, imagined telling them everything they'd done wrong, listing every hurt like charges in court. But sitting there seeing how small they looked in that familiar kitchen, I realized something. They already knew. I didn't come back for an apology, I said quietly. I came because I don't want to carry this forever, and I don't want you to either. Dad's eyes filled. I can't change what I did, he said, but I want to do better, if you'll let me. I nodded slowly. We can try. That was all. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But a door opening. Before I left, I walked through the house one last time. Touched the door frame where Mom had marked our heights when we were kids. Ran my hand along the banister Dad had sanded smooth decades ago. In the living room, I stopped at her old chair. I hope you saw that, Mom, I whispered. I hope you know I tried. Then I went back to my truck. Dad stood on the porch as I drove away, one hand raised in a small, uncertain wave. I waved back. That night, packing my bag for the next assignment, I felt something new settle in my chest. Not triumph. Not anger. But a quiet sense of rightness. I hadn't crushed them. I hadn't walked away either. I'd stood my ground. And in doing so, I'd made space for something I never thought I'd have again. A chance. The morning I left, frost coated the ground like a thin layer of glass. I'd driven out to the farmhouse before sunrise, wanting a few quiet minutes before the day began. The sky was just starting to lighten pale gray, turning soft pink along the horizon. The fields were still the kind of stillness you only find in places that have watched generations come and go. Dad was already on the porch. He stood there with a mug of coffee in both hands, wrapped in his old coat, looking smaller than I remembered him from my childhood. When he saw my headlights sweep across the yard, he straightened, then relaxed again. I parked and stepped out, pulling my jacket tight against the cold. For a moment we just stood there, the two of us breathing in the quiet. "You didn't have to come out this early," I said. He shrugged. "Habit, and I wanted to see you off." I nodded. We walked together toward the edge of the porch, looking out over the land. The trees were bare now, their branches reaching up like dark lines against the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. "I've been thinking about your mother a lot," Dad said finally. "About what she'd say if she were here." I didn't answer right away. "I think she'd tell us to stop being so stubborn," I said. "Both of us." He gave a small, rough laugh. She always did. Then he grew quiet again. "I should have been there for you," he said. "When you left, when you called. I didn't know how to say I was scared, that I didn't want you going into danger. So I turned it into anger instead." I looked at him surprised. He'd never admitted fear before. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he went on, "but I did, and I'm sorry." The words were simple, but they were real. My chest tightened and I felt my eyes sting. "I know you were scared," I said softly. "So was I. I just needed you to believe in me." He nodded slowly. "I do now." We stood there in silence again, the light growing around us. After a moment, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper worn at the edges. "It's one of your mother's notes," he said. "I found it in her Bible after the funeral. I never showed anyone." He handed it to me. With cold fingers, I unfolded it. "Tell her I'm proud, even if she's far away." That was all. I swallowed hard, unable to speak for a second. "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded, his eyes shining. When it was time to go, I slung my bag over my shoulder and walked toward my truck. Dad followed a few steps behind. At the door, I turned back to him. "I'll be back," I said. "Not just for court, not just for business, for visits." "I'd like that," he said. We didn't hug. But he reached out and put a hand on my shoulder just for a moment. It was enough. The drive back to base felt lighter than the one that had brought me home weeks earlier. I thought about everything that had happened, the courtroom, the shock on Dad's face, General Caldwell's steady voice, Eric's confession, the judge's ruling. All of it had mattered. But what stayed with me most was this, standing on that porch at dawn, hearing my father finally say he was proud. I realized then that the real witness in that courtroom hadn't just been the general. It had been the truth. Truth about who I was. Truth about what I'd done. Truth about what my family had lost by not seeing it sooner. And truth has a way of changing people if they let it. Back in my quarters, I packed away the note from Mom in the small wooden box where I kept a few treasured things, photos from deployments, a worn patch from my first unit, a medal I'd never told anyone about. That note went on top. Every time I'd doubt myself, I knew I could read it again. "Tell her I'm proud." Weeks later, after settling into my new assignment, I got a letter in the mail. Real paper, handwritten. It was from Dad. He wrote about fixing the fence again, about Eric helping more around the place, about how quiet the house felt but how he was learning to live with it. And at the end, in shaky handwriting, he wrote, "I tell folks now my daughter is a Marine officer. I say it like it's the best thing I ever did right." I held that letter for a long time. If there's one thing this whole journey taught me, it's this. Standing up for yourself doesn't make you cruel. And being strong doesn't mean you have to be alone. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak the truth even when it shakes the people you love. Especially then. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you've lost or someone you still need to reach out to, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect. Maybe share it with a friend who could use a little hope. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this told from the heart, I invite you to subscribe and stay with us. Your support helps keep these voices alive. Thank you for listening. And wherever you are, I hope you know this. You matter. Your story matters. And it's never too late for truth to lead the way. 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 To lead the way.